Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome to the podcast. Today's podcast is sponsored by American Reformer. American Reformer is an organization whose mission is to promote a vigorous Christian approach to the cultural challenges of our day, rooted in the rich tradition of Protestant social and political thought. Focusing particularly on the issues facing American Christian, it seeks to contribute to the reformation of Christian institutions that have become corrupted and are being dragged off base today. You can check out American Reformer at americanreformer.org. So thank you again for listening. I had a very interesting piece of news that I read this week, which is about the Census Bureau changing the definition of urban. That's interesting to me because I'm someone who has studied urban areas. I worked for the Manhattan Institute, where I was a senior fellow focused on urban policy, particularly focused on Midwest cities for many years. Professionally and personally, I have studied cities and the places of America and what makes them tick. And so this sort of thing is, of course, very interesting to me. And what they did was they changed the threshold for what counts as urban. You may have heard that America is 80% urban. And that is true according to the Census Bureau, but that's not what most people think of when they think of urban. Up until this recent change, any place with more than 2,500 people in America was considered urban. Where I come from, that's a small town. That's a very small town by a lot of standards. John Cougar's small town of Seymour, Indiana has something around 25,000 people in it. So that's the small town he was singing about. And so the Census Bureau raised the threshold from 2,500 to 5,000, which is still way, way too small in my opinion. And so if you strip out every place with less than 50,000 people, you end up with about 70% of the country being urban. But even then, that's very misleading because that includes the suburbs. The suburbs are really where it's at in terms of people. When we think of cities, we tend to think of dense, walkable, transit type neighborhoods, mixed use, downtown kinds of places. New York is, of course, the most well-known and extreme version of that. And if you look at the number of people who live in that kind of environment, it's really not all that high in America. The combined populations of the municipalities of New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, the District of Columbia, Boston, Seattle, Phoenix, San Francisco, Baltimore, you add those all together, it's about 20 million people. And really, New York City's, 8.5 million people. So almost half of that is in New York alone. There just aren't that many truly urban places in America. Now, if you add to that sort of college towns, which are functionally urban, or places in cities like Indianapolis, which are very sprawly, which do have urban areas, I'm going to guesstimate that there are 30 to 40 million truly urban people in America, with everybody else living a sort of suburban lifestyle. But this news prompted me to think about, where should we live? What kinds of places should we live in? There's a lot of debate about this today. Some people, migration had been in decline for a while in America, and with COVID, it picked back up. Remote work is letting people choose where they want to live. If you have a job where you're not tied to an office, you can live wherever you want. Other people moved because of COVID in various places. Hey, they're too locked down here, let's move to Florida. Others are moving because of politics. A lot of people want to get out of these sort of progressive cities where these DAs aren't enforcing laws and all of that stuff. Other people are very progressives who are in places like Indiana saying, I got to get out of here. I don't like these laws. I want to go someplace more congenial. So people are sorting, and there are opportunities today to think, where should I live? So I just want to talk a little bit about this topic. It's one I've talked about before, and I will certainly return to it again. I'm not going to give you like every bit of detailed information about how to think about this issue, but I want to talk about different types of communities and different things and kind of give you a little bit of the pros and the cons and let you maybe sort through what you want to think about. So the first, I guess, decision is, do you want to be in a blue state or a red state or a purple state? There are pros and cons to each. If you're in a deep blue progressive city, but you're in a red state, the amount of damage that city is going to be able to do is probably going to be somewhat limited in the sense that there's going to be some sort of oversight from the state government. And if they start getting too crazy, then you're going to, they're going to get, some check from the state. The state might pass some preemptive legislation, for example. Similarly, red areas of blue states like the Central Valley in California, they're going to get, all the blue laws imposed on them, as it were. I really don't like places that don't have political competition, to be quite honest, because governance tends to get bad when you lack political competition. Indiana has Republican supermajorities in the legislature, completely Republican-controlled state. It's not especially well run. Blue states, not especially well run. Cities that are totally Democrat-controlled, not well run. It's good to have some amount of political competition because then you have to be responsive to the voters, and you actually have to govern well. People are going to look at your results. Whereas in a lot of these places today, it doesn't matter if you're any good or whether you have any qualification whatsoever. The only thing that matters is whether you have an R or a D after your name. I think single-party politics is unhealthy. Nevertheless, I've chosen to live in a red state, which just happens to be my home state of Indiana. That's where I am. That's one thing to sort. Do you feel comfortable living in a red state or a blue state? First thing. The second thing you have to decide here is, do you want to be city, suburb, small town, rural? And I like to think about cities in a lot of different ways. The first is just thinking about like urban centers. So I have lived predominantly in urban centers my entire adult life. I grew up in a very rural area. I grew up on a gravel road. Initially, it was a gravel road, and I lived in a trailer, and we had got our water out of a cistern, and we had a party line telephone, and we burned our trash, and all of that stuff. So I had the full-on rural experience. I know that well. As an adult, I've lived predominantly in urban centers. And in urban centers, you can get that genuine walkable lifestyle if you want to. It's great to be able to walk 5 minutes to a coffee shop or to a restaurant or to a store, and you don't have to get in your car and go everywhere. I like that. A lot of people like that. Now, some people don't like that, but if you like that kind of lifestyle, it's a lot harder to get if you're not in a city center. Although in small towns you can get it. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So there's a good lifestyle there. Urban centers also tend to have the most high quality of everything. Suburbia tends to be more middle class. It tends to be more mass market. If you want the best, the best restaurants, the best bakeries, the best independent businesses, they're predominantly going to be found in the city center. And that's where, the arts organizations and things like that are likely to be found. So if you're really into the opera, for example, as I am, then living a 10-minute walk from the Metropolitan Opera House, as I used to, is a great thing. You're never going to get that in a suburb. So you have to decide if that kind of lifestyle is something that you want. On the other hand, these communities are invariably hyper-dominated by an increasingly oppressive, progressive social environment. If you've been in a city, if you've lived in a city, if you've walked down a street, then you've seen that progressive propaganda is essentially ubiquitous. Even here in Indianapolis, you walk down the street, every fifth house has something. It's an "in this house" sign, it's a BLM sign, you name it, it's there. It's very present, it's very active. And if you are a conservative, you will be made to feel unwelcome in those environments at times if you come onto people's radar. There was a donut shop right around the corner from my house that failed to post the requisite Black Lives Matter signage, failed to issue a statement about Black Lives Matter, and became the target of intense vilification by people, and were ultimately kind of driven out of business. And that sort of activism doesn't affect everybody, everything, but it is essentially allowed to proceed unchecked, and it's a uniparty, and very few people are ever going to push back on that in most of these cities. Basically, the far left activists, although they are not the majority of these places, can essentially get away with doing anything they want in these cities. And, in New York, actually, there's much more pushback against that. There's actually some, political and social diversity there. It is completely absent from a place like Indianapolis, which is 100% essentially owned and controlled by the far left socially, not politically. We have sort of moderate politics in a sense, sort of centrist Democrats, but if you're not willing to live in a place that's saturated with a sort of Orwellian social hegemony of progressivism, then the center city is not going to be for you. And if you're in the center city, you basically can't expect any sort of fairness or justice from any of the institutions, which are essentially entirely politicized today. So that's one you got to think about. Do you want to live in the center cities? There's a lot of benefits there. Also comes with high costs, sometimes literally high cost in terms of housing prices. Another type of community is the pre-war suburb. Now, some of these have been annexed into cities. You often hear the term streetcar suburbs. So a lot of these were built up along streetcar lines or around rail lines. And many of them in the ultra big cities actually still have commuter rail connections into downtown Chicago. I lived in Evanston, Illinois for a while, which is a pre-war suburb. It's really a city. It could have easily been annexed into the city of Chicago. But that North Shore of Chicago, Winnetka, Wilmette, Highland Park, places like that, older homes, often amazingly beautiful homes, often railroads, often with small center city downtowns of their own in historic areas. So this is where you can actually get the urban experience in a sort of miniature scale while still living in a suburb. So here in Indianapolis, one of our northern suburbs is called Noblesville. It's the county seat of Hamilton County. And there's probably about a 15,000 person historic center with, it was, lots of older homes, Victorians and the like, a very nice downtown. So you can live in one of these older homes in the center of town and walk to a lot of things. It's not quite socially going to be like the city in terms of the levels of excellence and things like that. Nevertheless, these sort of cities can offer some of the benefits of urbanism in a suburban environment. And a lot of these pre-war suburban areas are actually incredibly desirable. They are some of the most desirable suburbs in a lot of places. Extraordinarily expensive in many places. Although, again, small towns, there are some that are not expensive, so you can look at what that looks like. Then there's a variety of sort of post-war suburban types. There's the immediate post-war 40s and 50s suburbia, the sort of Levittown suburbia. This is typically relatively unattractive today. This is when they started mass-producing homes, and a lot of the homes that were mass-produced, again, the cookie-cutter subdivision emerged in this area, and these tend to be very small homes. Some of them are like 700-800 square feet, 2 to 3 bedroom, 1 bath, no basement, built on a slab. Sometimes some of the water pipes and utilities are in the slab. They really can't be economically repaired. And they're kind of worker cottages, I call them here. There are a ton of these, and they tend to be too small and too modest for today's families, although they are often attractive starter homes in urban areas where they happen to be located in sort of hip, cool districts. If you don't have kids and it's just you and your wife, then living in a small bungalow or something can be cool. But once you start having kids, once you start acquiring more stuff, it's not going to be as attractive. The places where these have held their value are in some of the big coastal metropolises where it's been hard to build new housing, and therefore everything's very, very expensive. So Lakewood, California, near Los Angeles, is an example of a Levittown-style subdivision that still held its value because it's virtually impossible to build housing in California. Housing prices are so high everywhere that it spills into these areas. Also kind of hyper-growth areas where the growth is so fast in some of these Sunbelt places that it sort of fills up everything. But this is kind of an out-of-favor kind of typology today. Most of you are probably not looking at that. Then there's what I call the older suburbia, which is 60s up through, say, 1990s. These tended to be a little bit bigger, a little bit nicer. What I think is interesting about these is they often do have a lot of housing type diversity in some of these older subdivisions. If you go around here in Indianapolis and there's sort of older suburban areas, they actually have aged well in terms of being physically attractive. They're still small closets, lots of issues compared with today, but they're not quite in the the Levittown style model. They tend to be a little bigger. This is where you start getting 3 bedrooms, couple of baths, family room. You get a little more space in that. And so one of the challenges with these typologies, though, is that early suburbia, that pre-1990, even the Levittown type homes, in a lot of places have really fallen into decay. Inner ring suburbia is getting beaten up, particularly outside of what I want to discuss later is the favored quarter. So if you were sort of the place where average middle class people were moving in the 50s and the 60s, and you're an inner ring suburb, and you got a lot of low grade strip malls, and it was always sort of just whatever the generic thing that was being thrown up at the time. These places are aging very poorly across America. Many of them are in decline. Many of them are experiencing significant inflation in taxes because of all their unfunded liabilities. The south suburbs of Chicago are really struggling here. A lot of the inner ring suburbs of a place like Chicago, where the population is stagnant to declining in the region, property taxes are high, unfunded liabilities are high. So you really have to watch out with inner suburbia that you're not basically buying into a very declining area. And you'll often see this even in like decent, still well-maintained communities. You drive around, you look at who lives there. A lot of time it's aging in place boomers. And you start asking, are there kids here? Is there a next generation here? Or is there going to be any demand for this going forward? So you want to be looking at the trends in some of these areas, because inner suburbia is really in trouble across a lot of America. Although if you're in a neighborhood that is doing better, then the housing is going to be a bit better than the early Levittowner types. Moving on to sort of newer suburbia, these tend to be a little more cookie cutter, and again, in my opinion. But the houses are bigger. They've got the 2 to 3 car garage. They've got 4 bedrooms and 3 baths, and they're more modern. They've got higher ceilings. They don't have the 8-foot ceilings like you have in the ranches and those older homes. And they're starting to become basically these are the kinds of homes that people want to live in today. These tend to be built really, really, really cheaply. I don't know how long some of these are going to last. As this one architect put it, these houses aren't designed to last a day past the end of the mortgage. But nevertheless, depending on, and there's a variety of price points. This isn't true of all of them. These are the kinds of growing new places today. And so you go to kind of where are the growing suburbs in cities today? Where are the hot places where they're building the new shopping centers and they're building the new interstate interchanges and they're building the new subdivisions? That's these places. And because they're new, they're doing well. And they'll probably do well for a while, but like that older inner suburbia that's kind of falling into decay, you got to ask what's going to preserve these places over the longer term. And so I would say that you need to divide newer suburbia into essentially 2 different types, what's called favored quarter and everything else. So in a lot of cities, you end up with essentially a 1/4 pie slice area coming out of downtown, which is where most of the wealthy people live. This is where the upscale shopping is. It's where the white-collar businesses are located, that sort of thing. It's often concentrated in one area of town. In the eastern U.S., it's often north. So here in Indianapolis, the favored quarter is north. Columbus, Ohio, it's north. Atlanta, Georgia, it's north. In some cities like Cincinnati, it's much more complicated. In Louisville, it's the east because it was, upstream of the Ohio River. So a lot of it has to do with how the water flows, how the wind blows. You don't want to be downwind from where the factories are, for example. And so the favored quarter is where you're going to find most of the amenities. It's where you're going to find the highest housing prices. And these are the places that have been most durable. The most famous writer on cities is Jane Jacobs. And, even in her 1960 Death and Life of Great American City, she's like, look, she's very negative on suburbia. But she's like, the most affluent suburbs do tend to hold their value. And so these are the most in-demand places. These are also the places that are becoming blue and purple. If you hear about Loudoun County, Virginia, for example, the controversies that are going on there, these are a lot of the upscale suburbs where a lot of the corporate people live. Of course, all the corporations are embracing ESG, DEI, and so the people who live there, they're in that upper middle class or better milieu. They are very heavily forced in that direction. However, unlike in the city, there is not this total hegemony. There's always dissent, and I think there will continue to be dissent. And I think the types of governance dysfunctions of the city are not going to be tolerated in these places. So I don't think defund the police is going to get very far in these suburbs. They're going to demand public safety. And there's just a lot of differences there. And so the suburbs, and when people say the suburbs are trending blue, these are the kinds of suburbs they're talking about. And this is where the college-educated, affluent class, top 20, 25% education income, they live in these places. And socially and politically, they've been drifting to the left. And so these places tend to be more liberal, whereas the non-favored quarter suburbs tend to be much more culturally and socially red, with the exception of where they've become very heavily minority. And then they're shaped by the sensibilities of the minorities who live there. Politically, generally to the left, but the type of social environment is going to depend on who lives there. The truth is, most of the diversity in America now is in the suburbs because that's where most of the people live. And so the suburbs are becoming more diverse. You shouldn't assume that just because something is a suburb, it's totally white bread. That's not true. These ultra wealthy places, for example, they got a lot of diversity now. Again, it's not as diverse as the central city, but rich Asian people, rich black people, they like the same things as rich white people. They like nice stuff. They like nice homes. They like public safety, all that stuff. And so there's essentially diversity everywhere now. But some of these places have become majority minority in a lot of areas. They, saying Southern California, many of them become heavily Asian. Some of the south suburbs of Chicago have become heavily black. So, depending on, if that's you, then, that might be a place that's going to be attractive to you. If you're like this Asian professional, you may feel like you like being in a more, kind of upscale Asian suburb rather than a city. But I think that the non-favored quarter is much more middle class. These are the ones that tend to struggle over the long term. They don't all go into decline, but they do tend to struggle. But they tend to be more solidly conservative red in a lot of places. And they have that more cultural environment. They have less of the sort of wokeness simply because the kinds of people who promote that tend to be in the very, very top scale they have. So these are essentially the suburbs. And then you have to think about when it's a city, that's kind of you think of it as a transect of kind of things from downtown out to the suburbs. You also have to think about whether you're in a large region or a small region. Large regions are really 1 million or more, I would say, but really 2 million or more. You really start to get like solidly large region. Indianapolis is really kind of the bottom of what I call the large region. We're a little over 2 million people here. And when you're in a big city, you have by and large, have the amenities of a big city. You've got an airport with flights to places. You have pro sports teams. You have decent shopping, dining options. You've got a thicker labor market, which means you don't just have one big employer. You've got a lot of different employers. One of the reasons I picked the 2 million threshold is because there's a famous study by Dora Costa and Matt Kahn called Power Couples. They are, by the way, a married power couple. They're two great economists. And basically they found that dual career professional households were conglomerating in places with more than 2 million people because both the husband and the wife need to have career options. And people think about, can I move from employer to employer? The bigger the city that you live in, the bigger the labor market, the more likely you're able to have amenities, the more likely you're able to have like high quality hospital care, different specialties. For example, the whole state of Indianapolis is the only city with a level 1 trauma center, for example. And even here, having lived in Chicago and New York, I just assume, of course, you've got access to all this stuff everywhere you go. It's amazing how quickly the availability of certain things drops off once you get out of the biggest cities. There are a lot of things we don't have here. On the other hand, sort of the basics around, can you get like good coffee? That's pretty much everywhere now. But you need to think about, do I want to be in a bigger place or a smaller place? Smaller places can be good, but they're going to have less amenities. They might not have great airport connections, or, you're going to have like a handful of flights, etc. A lot of people have been moving out to places like Moscow, Idaho, sort of both very conservative people who are attracted to sort of the Doug Wilson outpost there, or very liberal people who are attracted to the college town. There's an airport in Moscow, but it's got one flight a day that leaves at 6 a.m. So you're driving an hour and a half to Spokane probably to take an airport. It's a great town, amazing quality of life, but you have to understand that there's going to be some things that you're not going to get. You're not going to have the amenities of a general, true urban area there. So that's sort of the urban case. What happens when you get into the small towns and the rural areas? And a lot of people are very enamored of the small town and the rural areas. Let's just move back and repopulate the small towns. As someone who grew up in a rural area, I am not nearly as bullish on small towns as a lot of people are, or rural areas. It is not the idyllic Mayberry, image that you might have. It's not like the 1980s where, when I was growing up, people didn't lock their doors and they left their keys in their car and all that stuff. Today, tremendous social dysfunction. These places have huge drug issues, opioids, meth, massive family breakdown, massive intergenerational single motherhood, all of this stuff. It's really dysfunctional in a lot of ways. And if you're someone who's gotten used to enjoying the social milieu of people with college degrees, they tend to have very low education levels, and so you're dealing in a social environment that might not be what you're used to if you haven't lived in one of those places for a while. So there's also the fact that, if you're not close to a city, you could end up, again, without access to an airport, without access to quality medical care. It's stunning to me that people in southern Indiana, it could be an hour, 2 hours away from Indianapolis. You got to go to Indianapolis to get any sort of health care beyond the routine. And so these places can be good for a certain type of people. I've said this before. If you are really a homesteader type, if you're really into hunting and fishing, if you're really handy, if you love the outdoors, there's great benefits to being in these small towns. If you don't have that orientation, if you need to get on a plane and go somewhere, you got to watch. Where I think the sweet spot in small towns is small towns that are satellite cities of major urban areas, where you are 45 minutes or less, certainly an hour or less. You could go out to an hour. If you're 45 minutes, especially 30 minutes or less, is ideal, where you can get into the city when you need to. You could potentially work in the city a couple days a week. You can get to an airport. You can do whatever you need, but you're also in the small town. And then also, the rules of thumb I use to evaluate a small town, just look at the historic buildings in downtown. Is the downtown intact, and are there businesses there? If there's an intact downtown, that's an excellent sign. And then look at the historic housing stock. If they're old, nicer, old Victorian-type homes, that's a very good sign. If it's mostly worker cottage-type housing, that's not necessarily a great sign. And so here in Indiana, there are a ton of these cities that I think are really interesting, small town type places that are commutable or semi-commutable to Indianapolis. I'm sure I'm not the first person that's had this point of view. When I went out to Moscow, Idaho, and visited it for the first time, I'm like, man, you could replicate Moscow in all these small towns all over the place. And, Moscow is 25,000 people. It does have a state university there. The state's flagship university is there, so it's a college town. And it's also only 8 miles from a slightly larger Pullman, Washington, where there's a Pac-12 school, land-grant school in Washington State. So it's a little unique, but it's a really amazing town. And, even very liberal people love Moscow. And, wow, we could do that. Well, one, you're going to go to the small town of the Midwest. It's probably not going to have this sort of college milieu where there's a lot of people with college degrees and sort of that sensibility. But there are huge opportunities, and I think there are many small towns around Indianapolis with huge opportunities. But the question is, are there enough people to do that? If you don't make changes at scale, then these towns aren't going to transform, both in terms of investment. I'm just talking about pure investment, fixing up the downtown buildings, fixing up the houses, starting to bring some of these places back, because almost all these small towns are either they're already discovered super uber wealthy places like, say, Woodstock, Vermont, right, where anything that's super great has probably already been discovered and already been turned into Park City, Utah or something, where the rich people taking it over, you're going to pay a fortune to get in there. or it's in decline. Right? There seem to be the two places. And a lot of places have huge opportunities, and they're great opportunities for like religious groups to think, wow, we could come in here, we could build the next Moscow. The only problem is, as Brookings Institution demographer William Fry once said, there aren't enough yuppies to go around to save Detroit. And there is a certain thing. How many people are going to move in there? You can make a huge impact with 50 to 100 people move to these places. It would be like transformational. But how many friends do you have who are willing to go do that? Something to think about. Are you going to isolate yourself socially? Are you going to move to a place because you went there and it looked awesome? And you're going to go there and you're going to find out, for example, that, your kids will still be considered like the new kids are not really part of the town because everybody's been here for 7 generations, right? And you're not going to be fit in. You're not going to be as socially accepted. It's going to be very clannish. You're going to be expected to do what everyone else does. And if you're slightly different, it's going to cost you some pain. And so those are things to get, visiting a place is very different from living there. So with those caveats, though, I think they can be very good. I think the sweet spot is a sort of an intact, small town, 20 to 30 miles from a major urban center. Here in Indianapolis, we've got multiple of those that I think are just ready to blow up, and some of them already are. So that's where I'd say. That's kind of the different ways you can think about it. Red state, blue state, purple state. You want to be large urban, small urban, rural. Where on this sort of transect of typologies of neighborhoods, if you're in an urban environment, do you want to live? Those are things to think about. So you might ask, Aaron, where are you living? We are actually moving to that town I wrote about in the newsletter, Carmel. It is a favored quarter suburb, mostly new. I would classify it as a newer suburb, but probably about 40% of the town was developed prior to 1990. And so we are actually moving into an older 1960s area of that. And we went there primarily because there are some services we need for our son. And so that's a consideration. If it were just me and my wife, we might have moved south into one of these satellite small towns that still are very Mayberry-like. But again, if you have if you need stuff, right? If you need medical care, if you have a special needs kid, if you've got anything of that nature, you're going to find that the pickings are slim outside of essentially the favored quarter of a major city. So you have to think about that. And the other thing you have to think of, especially if you're going to do remote work, is if you're leaving the big city and going to a smaller city, you're leaving New York City, you're coming to Indianapolis, then it's going to be harder to network at the elite levels. I always say that young people are better off being in the office, in the big cities, because they gain so much experience, so much network. And at some point, you can kind of take a step back. But if you decide to do the remote work and just be a programmer in rural wherever, you are sort of taking a step back. Moving to Indianapolis is sort of taking a step back. Now, I got lucky because the pandemic really made it so that my network actually got better after I left New York City, which would not have happened but for the pandemic. Lots of things went virtually, and I know a lot of people, and because of my writing and the public profile, I'm able to build networks without being physically present in other places. So Indianapolis has turned out to be a great base for us. But let's make note, and it's, we're from there, and red state. There's a lot of benefits to being here. On the other hand, let's not mistake that, we're not giving things up by leaving New York. It would be nice to have $1 billion so that I could have a place in New York and a place here, and we can sort of split our time and get the best of both worlds. But that's sort of what we're doing. And so there are considerations that you have to have, and there's pros and cons to each. And as you look in these different neighborhoods, different towns, something to think about. So with that, I will talk to you in a couple of weeks. What's going to happen is next week, we're going to have the newsletter coming out, so I have the audio newsletter. Then the next couple of weeks, I'm going to have interviews with people on the podcast, which I'm trying to get recorded because my studio is going to be out of commission with my move, as I said. So I'm getting some pre-recorded content, and then we'll get back to these live streams, hopefully in the near future. Thanks for joining.